What's up, everyone? No, I'm actually at the podium and not my mom this time. So yeah, I'm Tahrieq, if you don't know who I am. All right. So to start off this chapel talk, I'd first off like to thank the faculty for choosing me to receive the Founders Prize and being a foundational support when I want to do crazy things like go to China for a year. Without your support over the last 4 years, I don't know what I would have done. Going off on the topic of China, I love to sit here and show you all the adventures and go off on a tangent about how much I love China. But I personally believe that my outward bound experience was a lot more beneficial to me as a person, and I want to share that experience with you all today. Trying to decide which course to attend was a very grueling process. Outward Bound offers so many cool courses that interested me. If you all don't know me by now, you know that I'd like to do crazy things, and I'm always trying to push myself out of my comfort zone. So when deciding courses to choose from, I tried to stay as far from the East Coast as possible and tried to look for courses in the Midwest or on the West Coast. The one that I eventually chose was a 15-day whitewater rafting and mountaineering course in Redmond, Oregon. Redmond, Oregon is in the middle of absolute nowhere. I had to fly from Portland International Airport into this tiny shack of an airport where all the outward bound students were flying into. When I landed, I was introduced to some of the people I would be embarking on this journey with. They were all cool and all just excited as I was. Next thing we did was load onto a bus and drive for about an hour and a half to go to this place where we would be starting our river section of the course. This is where things start to get interesting. We were introduced to our instructors who were probably the quirkiest people I've ever met. We called them the Triple Ds because their names all started with D. Dana, Devin, and Dan. These three got so excited about being out in nature. You could tell they were passionate about what they did, and that motivated me to jump in with both feet. We were separated into our individual groups, and then we started to pack our bags so that we could go to our campsite for the night and get on the river the next morning. After a couple safety briefings and an overview of how camp was set up, we were finally allowed to crash and the 15-day journey had officially begun. The next morning at 6:30, we had to wake up. The first thing we did was referred to as stretching pump. Basically, it was a time in the morning where people made a fool of themselves in order to get their body ready for the rigorous activities for the day. Here's an example of what stretching pump looked like. Then it was time to eat breakfast and break down camp. Unfortunately, that took a group of 10 lazy teenagers about 2 hours to do, which is crazy inefficient. It was already 8:30 when we hadn't even gotten briefed on the river, and the Death Star had peeked over the hill and was slowly roasting us. Eventually, we got to talk about the river and were introduced to the river, which was the Descahooties River. That day, we were paddling about 9 miles to our next campsite. After a few lessons, students were given control of the boat, and at this point, I was afraid for my life. I swore that we would hit a rock or something that would puncture the boat, and it would be a wrap for all of us. But as the day progressed, we didn't hit anything, so being extremely relieved, I gave the 9 of the students I was with a bit more of my trust. That night, we got into camp early at around 4:30, and we quickly began to set up camp. Even though we barely knew how to set up this makeshift tarp that we slept under, we still got it up. It might have been very wobbly, and if there was wind, we'd be sleeping under the stars, but it still worked for us because we were just exhausted. At around 7, we ate dinner and sat in what we call the dinner circle. In that circle, we just talked about the activities of the day and bonded as a group. After dinner was over, we had about an hour to spare before we had our official nightly meetings. There, we reflected on the day, got deep, shared some funny stories, and went over nuts and bolts for the next day. For the rest of the 13 days, that was the structure every night. After the meeting, it was time to hit the hay and get ready for the next day. On day 3 was when things got really exciting. We hit our Class 3 rapid called Wapanita Rapids. A Class 3 rapid requires that boaters ground their boats and scout the rapids, and head protection is recommended. The rapid was Class 3 because there was a tremendous amount of strainers, which are fallen rocks, logs, and branches that needed to be avoided by all means necessary. Of course, at this point, I'm scared out of my mind. This is my first time whitewater rafting, and I'd actually hit the whitewater part of the rafting. I was overwhelmed with excitement and fear. As you can see, that run was successful because I'm standing in front of you today with no missing limbs or broken bones. Over the next 2 days, we went through 2 more Class 3 rapids, and after that, it was time to transition into the mountains. The mountain range we were going to was the Three Sisters Wilderness. The mountains were a totally different ball game compared to the river. Instead of having a gear boat that could lug around all our gear and food, we now had to carry that all on our backs. On the first day, my pack must have been about 60 to 65 pounds. The pack I had was about half my height and had my sleeping bag, food, clothes, climbing rope, which was super heavy, my personal tarp, and any other miscellaneous gear that needed to be carried. Of course, the day we had the most hills was the day that I volunteered to take an extra 10 pounds on my back of water. My hip flexors were not prepared for the beating they got the first couple of days because all the weight from the bag was on my hips, and the motion of lifting my legs up was really giving them a workout. For the next 9 days, my body took a beating. The first couple of days, we only went about 3 miles. That might sound like a lot to you, but in comparison with other hikers on the trail, that was light work. Some hikers we had passed went 10 to 15 miles in the time it took us to go 3. Granted, they were traveling significantly lighter than we were, but it puts our progress in perspective. After that, we had to make up for the loss. We needed to make up for the time lost and needed to destroy consecutive long mileage days in order to stay on track. Day 3 in the mountains was a 9-mile day, and day 4 and 5 were both 7.5-mile days. At this point, our bodies had gotten used to the beating, and we were flying along the trail. In the same time it took us to do 3 miles, we completed the 9-mile day. On day 5 was the day that our instructors decided they wanted us to do our solo. This is the view from my solo site. A solo is basically you living by yourself for 24 hours with limited amount of food and water. During my solo, I had nothing but time to think and read, so I got a lot of my summer reading done during that time. But when I wasn't reading or making my reclining rock chair better, I was thinking about the trip, the people in our group, and the dynamic of our group as a whole. It was here where I learned the biggest lesson, and that I'll share at the end of the chapel talk. But first, I want to keep going with the cool stuff and save the deep stuff for last. The day after our solo was the day we were peaking a mountain. The mountain we were peaking was called the Husband. We didn't get to peak one of the Three Sisters because big groups can't peak the Three Sisters on a weekend. So instead, we decided to climb up a mountain opposite the sisters that was challenging and had 2 vertical faces. At this point, I was scared out of my mind because I'm petrified of heights. I just sort of sucked it up and said, if it's my time to go, at least I go out with a pretty awesome view. In the end, I made it to the top, and it was so worth me conquering my fear because now I'm not as afraid of heights as I used to be. After I had my relaxation at the top, I finally realized that going up was the easy part. Going down was going to be even harder. I was basically rappelling down the side of a mountain, putting my life in the hands of a prusik knot and a carabiner. Once my feet touched the bottom of the mountain and my pants had dried a little, I took a few of my first deep breaths, and one of my biggest fears were conquered. After the experience, the rest of the trip was basically us walking out of the Three Sisters Wilderness to get to the trailhead that we were being picked up at. And that was basically my trip in a nutshell. But what takeaway I want to share with everyone today is on the topic of compassion. Before I left for Outward Bound, I was struggling a bit. I was missing something internally, but I really didn't know what it was or have time to figure out what actually was missing. Over the summer, I was extremely busy. I was interning in corporate America, doing college tours, prepping for the ACT, writing college essays, and working on football stuff. And I really didn't have time to sit down and actually examine myself. I was losing track of who I was as a person because everything was about getting stuff done. I essentially became a workaholic. I didn't care about anything but getting work done. Then I went to Outward Bound and I was forever changed. The process was definitely not overnight. I would say it took just about all 15 days to fully comprehend and change who I was as a person. The main thing that made me recognize my faults was the dynamic we had as a group. This might sound super cheesy, but this was the best group dynamic I had ever been in. The foundation of the group grew on this idea of being compassionate and supportive to each other no matter what. Whether it was literally supporting each other up a mountain or helping someone get water so that dinner could get started earlier. This group made me realize that it's the small things that you do that can make someone's day. They essentially brought me back to reality and made me realize that sometimes you need to take a step back from the world and the rush of the world and slow down. It's when you slow down that you really realize everything that is going on, and you can show compassion to other people because your mind isn't focused on the end goal, it's focused on the journey. They made me realize that the journey is way more important than the end goal, and for that I am indebted to them because they made me into a better person. With this group dynamic and my time to think of my solo, I realized that I needed to change. So I decided to make that change and change myself for the better. As most of you know, I have changed a lot since my fourth form year. My year in China was dedicated to bettering myself physically, emotionally, and personally. That attitude was lost during the summer, but was revitalized after Outward Bound. I would like to leave everyone off on a quote by a world-renowned mountaineer and explorer, Sir Edmund Hillary. "It's not the mountain we conquer, but ourselves." Thank you.